Over on Gator 8, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about the 1997 Liberty Bowl between Pitt and Southern Miss, and how the Liberty Bowl tried to trade Pitt to another bowl game because they didn't want Pitt playing in the Liberty Bowl at all. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And join me tomorrow night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play NFL trivia for cash prizes. Link to play below. And now, on with our feature presentation. Every team whips on free agent signings. No one bats 1,000. There are moments where you sign a player thinking he's going to carry the success he had on his old team, or if you're re-signing a player, the same success that he's had so far, and it just doesn't work out that way. You give him a giant contract, and you have to cut him after a year or two, cutting off the contract way before you expected, simply because the player has underperformed that badly, and eating the cap hit is worth it compared to keeping him on the roster and paying out his salary. It happens, and while some of these re-signings and free agent signings hurt more than others, it is not a unique occasion by any means. So what makes this instance unique? What makes this instance involving the man you're watching, former Northwestern wide receiver Dwayne Bates, special in every way? He lasted one whole day. That was it. He got a 3-year contract and was cut one day after signing the contract. And it had nothing to do with any undisclosed injury or any off-the-field issue that the Chicago Bears were unaware of. No, he just got cut after one day because the Bears had no ability whatsoever to think logically and think critically. It's absolutely baffling how badly they bungled this situation, but we're going to take a deep dive into that today. This is the story of Dwayne Bates, and one of the dumbest free agent moves in the history of the Chicago Bears franchise. Before I talk about the actual signing in question, we need some context to understand just who Dwayne Bates is, why the Bears were interested in drafting him, and then why they were interested in re-signing him. And one of the reasons why you're seeing highlights of Bates from his time at Northwestern is because he was that good over there. If you ask people who the greatest receiver in the history of Northwestern football is, odds are most people would say that it was Dwayne Bates. And I would be here all day if I listed every single accolade and every single accomplishment that he had in his collegiate career. Because it is no surprise why so many people were high on him coming out of college and into the NFL. Over the course of his career, he had 210 receptions for 3,370 yards and 26 touchdowns. And these numbers, as great as they are despite a 1997 season where he only played in one game. He led the Big Ten in every category in 1996, winning the Triple Crown with 71 receptions for 1,196 yards and 12 touchdowns. Currently, he's 6th all-time in receiving yards in Big Ten history, but at the time of his final game, he was the all-time leader, and was 2nd all-time in conference history in receptions, only behind David Williams. Bates holds the record for most career receptions, most career receiving yards, most career receiving touchdowns, most career games of over 100 yards, and most career games of having a touchdown catch in Northwestern history. And it will be tough for anyone to break those records. Basically, anytime Northwestern needed a big play, they turned to Bates and tried to throw the ball his way. And if you ask people who the most important player on that 1995 team was to win the Big Ten for the first time ever and play in the Rose Bowl for the first time ever, and if you ask people who the most important player on that 1996 team was that also led Northwestern to a share of the Big Ten title, odds are they would say that it was none other than Dwayne Bates. He was that good, and because of his strong production and his incredible play, the Chicago Bears decided to draft him in the 3rd round of the 1999 NFL Draft. As for his time with the Bears, well, it was disappointing. And part of the reason why you're still seeing highlights of him from Northwestern is because there aren't a whole lot of highlights to show from his time with the Bears. Bates was constantly buried on the depth chart, and rarely got a chance to get on the field and showcase his abilities, as guys like Marcus Robinson, Eddie Kennison, and most notably, Marty Booker, were ahead of him in terms of the pecking order. Now when Bates got on the field, he did fine. He had surefire hands, and ended the 2001 season on a high note, where in the team's final 2 games, he had 8 receptions for 157 yards and a touchdown, showing that when seeing the field, he actually had the ability to produce. However, he was just too buried to do anything otherwise, as in 3 seasons with the Bears, he had 15 receptions for 221 yards and a touchdown. When you draft a guy in the 3rd round, and draft arguably the greatest receiver in Big Ten history at the time, I don't think you're expecting him to get 15 catches in 3 years. Still, as evidenced by the now NFL highlights we're showing of Bates, the Bears knew he had potential, and his final 2 games of 2001, where he looked the part for sure, gave them hope. Bates was going to be a restricted free agent in 2002, meaning that another team could sign him. However, the Bears would have the right to match the offer. And prior to the 2002 offseason, Bears general manager Jerry Angelo said that he was confident in Bates, showing that he expected to be on the team, move up the depth chart, and contribute in a big way like he did at the end of 2001. However, one team had other ideas, and that team was their division rival, the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings needed some help at the receiver position opposite Randy Moss, as Chris Carter, their number 2 guy, was going to be 37 years old and was declining hard, with his 2001 season being the worst of his career in every major statistical category since 1992. As a side note, to learn more about the career of Chris Carter and what happened to him during that 2002 offseason, where he did not return to the Vikings, click the card in the upper right corner. And the Vikings thought that Bates could be that guy to pair alongside Moss. With that, the Vikings signed Bates to a 3-year offer sheet. Under this agreement, the Vikings would pay $2.85 million over 3 years, including a $550,000 roster bonus. And there was speculation that the Bears would not match the deal, as even though it would stink to have Bates playing for a division rival, it would be tough to afford him and justify the salary while having Marty Booker, David Terrell, and Des White ahead of him on the depth chart. And it's not even like the Bears would have received compensation if they lost Bates, because they messed up the paperwork. In fact, it seemed like such a done deal that upon receiving this offer sheet, Ben Dogra, who was Bates' agent at the time, said, "Dwayne is excited about the possibility of playing on the same field as Randy Moss and Dante Culpepper. Being in an offense like that would really allow him to showcase his skills. It's an opportunity he is really excited about, and he really hopes he ends up in Minnesota. The Minnesota opportunity is just a great one." Tell him how you really feel, Dwayne. After 3 seasons of being buried on the depth chart, he was going to be a Minnesota Viking, so long as the Bears didn't match the deal. The Bears had a week to decide whether they wanted to match the offer sheet or let him walk to a division rival. And it truly was up in the air. 24 hours before the deadline, the Bears still had no idea and gave no indication as to what they were going to do, and whether or not they were going to bring Bates back. If anything, it was leaning toward no, as in, the Bears were not expected to bring him back. However, in a shocking twist of events, despite Bates being buried on the depth chart, and despite Bates expressing his desire to play for the Vikings, the Bears decided to bring him back. They weren't letting him go to a division rival. He was theirs, and they were going to match the 3-year, $2.85 million offer sheet. Just like that, Bates was back in the Windy City. On April 3rd, 2002, Bates was re-signed. He was cut on April 4th. Now, before we go any further, I want to emphasize that this had nothing whatsoever to do with an off-the-field issue or an undiagnosed injury that happened during a physical. This had to do with an entirely preventable issue that was entirely Chicago's own doing. Then again, I wouldn't expect anything less from the team that wouldn't have even gotten compensation for him in the first place if the Vikings got him, because they made an error in the paperwork. Because not even 24 hours after they signed Bates to a 3-year deal, they cut him. As General Manager Jerry Angelo said on the move, "After exploring our contractual options, we decided to waive Dwayne today." Huh? After debating whether or not to sign him to a 3-year deal, and then signing him to a 3-year deal, we decided that signing him to a 3-year deal wasn't a good move? How incompetent can you be? How the heck did you go 13-3 last year with management that brain dead? To be fair, Angelo had a reason for why he signed Bates, only to cut him 24 hours later. As part of the deal that the Vikings offered him, Bates would have gotten $1.1 million in 2002, and that's a big cap hit of 7 figures for a guy who is still going to be relatively buried on the depth chart. The most catches Bates ever had in a season at this point was 9. He was not going to be starting, and you're giving him 7 figures for the season? Not great. So the Bears tried to renegotiate a cap-friendly deal, and they were unable to renegotiate. And gee, it's hard to imagine why Bates wasn't interested in renegotiating and wanting to help you out. Seeing as he spoke glowingly on Minnesota and thought for sure he was heading there, you took until the last possible minute to decide his future, and seeing as he was going to be a starter in Minnesota before you matched and made him the 4th receiver on the depth chart again. As Angelo said, over the ensuing 24 hours, we attempted to renegotiate a more cap-friendly first year to Dwayne's contract and explored the possibility of a trade. Neither of those options were viable. Wait, let me get this straight. You tried to trade a guy immediately after signing him? First off, good luck getting any free agents and players to come here, knowing that you're going to try and offload them before the ink is dry after they sign the contract. Second, it's not like there was a restricted free agent bidding war going on with Bates. It took until the end of March, well into the process, for any team to even make an offer, where they didn't even have to give up any compensation. So to expect trade offers under those circumstances, where they'd have to give up something to you? That is mind-bogglingly dumb. And to make matters crazier, it's not like Bates was a surprise free agent. It's not like you had no idea that this was coming. It's not like the NFL just randomly spun a wheel of all the players on your roster and it landed on Bates, and because of this, he was a free agent. You knew from day one that he was going to hit free agency as a restricted free agent. You're telling me you didn't talk to him beforehand? You're telling me you didn't deliberate on a number that you would match and that you'd let him walk for? Were you just twiddling your thumbs throughout this entire free agency period? This is some of the worst planning I've ever seen in my life, because this just reeks of a team that was not prepared whatsoever for any team to sign Bates to an offer sheet. And you're never going to believe what happens next. Guess where Bates wound up playing his football in 2002? You guessed it, he was a new man on the Minnesota Vikings. Because of course he was. Good job, Bears. Your grand plan to sign Bates so that he couldn't go to a division rival didn't seem to take into account the possibility that after you cut him, he just chooses to play for that division rival. Especially when his agent flat out said, Dwayne hasn't wavered. He is so sold on the Vikings. He just wouldn't be happy in any other place. Which seems like something you should have thought about before you signed him to a 3-year deal, only to cut him 1 day later. This meant that not only did the Vikings now have their number 2 wide receiver, but on top of that, there was $1.3 million counting against the cap for Chicago for waiving Bates. The Bears had 7 figures docked against their cap for signing a player for a day and then having him produce for a division rival. Genius front office work all the way around. In Minnesota, unfortunately for the Vikings, Bates was not quite the man that they hoped he would be, as he only spent 2 seasons with the team and never quite lived up to the expectations that the team had for him. In those 2 seasons, he caught 65 passes for 840 yards and 5 touchdowns. While those numbers were obviously better than what he was doing in Chicago, and while he got to see way more of the field than he did in the Windy City, it was somewhat underwhelming considering the lofty expectations that many people had for him, and the giant saga involved in even acquiring his services in the first place. Bates never played another game in the NFL after 2003, finishing his career with just 80 receptions for 1,061 yards and 6 touchdowns across both Chicago and Minnesota. However, today, Dwayne Bates might be best known for being the dumbest free agent signing in the history of the Chicago Bears. At least with most free agent signings that fail, you can see why the team in question signed him. With the Bears, I've got nothing, as the only logical explanation for why they did it, which was to keep him but just renegotiate the first year of his deal, is really just a fancy way of saying that the Bears were incompetent, negligent, and poor planners and critical thinkers. So what's the moral of the story here? If you're going to sign a free agent, it's a good idea to not change your mind after 1 day, and to not waste 7 figures in cap space on a guy that you don't even have room for and that you don't really want. Because of all the ways to lose $1 million, in 2002, the Chicago Bears found what might just be the stupidest way to do so. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.